Well, good morning. Welcome back after 2 weeks of break to the Sunday Theology talks. And we start again, and welcome also to the people, they're here, the people who are kind of following via the live stream. So we resume the Bicentennial historical lectures. We had a string of wonderful speakers, but I have to say that behind everything we've done, there's been the unfailing work of the speaker today, Francis Blouin, who happens to be the archivist here at Saint Thomas, and he's worked with the previous speakers, especially Bishop Franklin, and I've seen personally the work he has done in the archives. I've been down several times, and I've been impressed by how this has enabled us to do the work we have done over the Bicentennial. Everything which has been kind of diligently catalogued by him and by Inge Rice this year today as well. So welcome Inge. So today we are going to touch on the figure of one of the most impressive figures of the history of Saint Thomas, Rector Ernest M, and who is known for his involvement in social gospel. And I'm particularly eager to listen to this lecture today because this is not just a historical lecture, but also is something that really comes very well together with another series of lectures we have been conducting this year, which is church and social justice, and particularly a symposium we are organizing for the Bicentennial in May, so 7 and 8 May, which is church, community church and civil society modalities of engagement. We're going to have a string of wonderful speakers from London, from the UK, for 2 evenings, and I'm going to send information very soon. A registration link is already available on the website, and there's a page on the website that gives some information. But I'm going to send the information also by email very soon. This to say that what we have been doing with the Bicentennial historical lectures is not a purely exercise of memory, however laudable and important this is. It's really looking at the past to find inspiration for the future. And for me, it's incredibly exciting and energizing to see that we have gathered, we had a meeting just a few days ago, a wonderful group of 30, some of them are here today, 35 people who have been inspired, and some of the youngest members of our congregation have been inspired by these lectures, by the work we have done, and now want to get involved, want to do something, want to be actively involved in the social outreach of St. Thomas. So you see, this is something which is a testimony to the life of our community, and personally something that gives me great joy. So Francis doesn't need very much introduction. He's very well known here to the people who are parishioners and to the people I joked with him that come from his fan base. So very welcome to the people who are here for the first time. So we're going to have so Francis is going to speak for some 30 minutes, I suppose, and then we're going to have a little time of questions, and we're going to stop at 11:15 because then there is class. So it's a great pleasure to meet you.
Thank you, Luigi, and I want to thank you all for coming, and it's a great pleasure for me to be participating in this lecture series, and particularly today talking about Father Stiers in the presence of his grandson, Whit Stiers, who came. It's one thing. Pardon? Great-grandson. To be specific. It's one thing to be doing research in the shadow of the archives, it's another to be doing research in the shadow of a descendant. I'm grateful that you came. In preparation for the exhibition downstairs, which many of you have seen, Arts in the Service of Faith, my distinguished collaborator Inge Rice and I spent a good deal of time focusing on the use of various artistic forms which at the highest level support the commitment of our parish to the worship of God. It's an important dimension of our service to faith. But as we contemplated this idea of service, and as we explored the archives of the parish, we found, particularly in the early part of the 20th century, service meant a good deal more than this commitment to artistic excellence. New York City at the turn of the last century was the financial capital of the world. It was also among the most important and largest centers of manufacturing in the nation. It was, as Bill Franklin said in a previous lecture, an industrial metropolis. The 5 boroughs had consolidated in 1898, and the total population of this consolidated city was 3.4 million. But in 1900, leaping to in 1920, it had become 5.6 million. So the growth of railroads in the United States opened the possibility of national markets for industrial goods. Corporations meeting these demands, along with the railroads themselves, needed enormous capital funding. And New York City, as we all know, was the center of finance to meet these demands. As a result, there was an enormous wealth generated in the city, and many who shared in this bounty were members of this parish and contributed to the construction of this building. However, I think we forget that at one time on this island, and to a lesser extent in all 5 boroughs, whole sections were devoted to the manufacturing of goods for local consumption. And these were shipped across the nation and even the world. In thinking about this talk, I came across this map that was in the New York Public Library, dated 1922. And this map shows that by 1920, there were more than 30,000 factories in New York City. And with 22,000 of them located in Manhattan, most of them in this area below 59th Street. And these factories were generated the industrial and financial transformation, and by the work of almost 800,000 working men and women working at relatively low wages, sustaining this production. Now, many of these workers and their families fell into the category of the industrious poor. And increasingly, this population was a concern of the broad section of the well-to-do and the middle classes of the city, particularly those with strong religious commitment. And out of this concern came the social gospel movement. The social gospel movement was essentially derived from a reading of the scriptures, less with an emphasis on personal salvation and more with an eye to the message of the gospel to serve those in need. Drawing from Matthew 25, as long as you do this to the least of my brethren, you do this for me. It was a call to action. Walter Rauschenbusch, in this famous book called Christianity and the Social Crisis, first published in 1907, really challenged Christians to think along these lines and be more active in their communities. Within this patch of complicated urban industrial economy was St. Thomas Church. Its great edifice, the third church, built in 1870, designed by Richard Upjohn, was a neighborhood landmark in an area populated by many prominent families, including Rockefellers and Vanderbilts. When that third church burned in 1905, the headline referred to St. Thomas as the center of the social world in the city. The rector at the time was Ernest Milmore Stiers. The Stiers were born in Norfolk, Virginia in 1866, graduated from the University of Virginia in 1888, and after studying at the Virginia Theological Seminary, he was ordained in the Episcopal Church in 1892. After service to parishes in Augusta, Georgia, and Chicago, Illinois, he was called to be rector of St. Thomas Church in 1901. St. Thomas then was a well-to-do parish situated in the Gilded Age splendor of Fifth Avenue mansions. The challenge for Father Stiers was to define a mission for the parish as it was situated within the larger context of the massive social and industrial dislocations of a growing urban and industrial economy. How would he address this issue? Would the parish be an isolated island of privilege, or would it look beyond its immediate surroundings to a broader mission? In the 1904 yearbook of the parish, he issued a statement proposing a particular mission for St. Thomas. This statement has been quoted in a relatively recent parish history by Canon Wright. Inga Reese mentioned it in her previous lecture, and we used it for our exhibit downstairs. However, I think it's not generally well known. I personally, as a historian, find it one of the most profound statements of Christian commitment that I've ever read. So today I want to do three things. First, I want to talk about the statement. Second, I want to talk about how the parish acted on the statement at the time. And third, I want to talk about why in subsequent decades it has been so hard to realize Father Stiers' simple formula. The statement, and I think it's in your handout, reads, and I'm going to read it entirely because it's so profound. He says, the mission of St. Thomas's is to the well-to-do for their own sake and for the sake of those who are not well-to-do. Things are unequally distributed in this world, and many suffer here from having too little, and many suffer from having too much. One clear class is unable to get the relief it needs, and the other has not learned to give the relief in its power. All must suffer until the relief is given. The mission of St. Thomas is to help us save ourselves by saving others, to regard all our successes, our influence, and our money as worth nothing in themselves, but worth much when devoted to elevating humanity. The pursuit of wealth for selfish ends is morally criminal. To make money for the purpose of making men is to do our duty to God, to our fellows, and to ourselves. Our hearts and hands must be quick to aid the suffering anywhere, to help God's cause everywhere. The mission work of the Church in this land must be more liberally sustained than ever before, for the needs and opportunities were never so great. So I think it's an extraordinary statement for the beginning of the 20th century, particularly generated from this place. It's courageous, concise, serious, and challenging. It articulates a basic concept of moral and social responsibility, which was at the heart of the social gospel movement. It shows remarkable awareness of and sensitivity to the broader population of the city. He wants to elevate humanity. That word is totally inclusive of all persons without limitation. He speaks of moral criminality, curiously, and not sin. In my view, he's linking personal responsibility with civic responsibility. Well, statements of this kind are only important if they're acted upon. And during the rectorship of Father Stiers, the parish was a beehive of activity. There was an extraordinary array of initiatives. Many of these Inga spoke about last time. There was the association, St. Thomas Association for Parish Work. This was a particularly important set of initiatives to the neighborhoods populated by what the parish called the industrious poor. In the preface to the 1906 report of this association, in the yearbook, it starts with scripture, "No man liveth unto himself, and no man dieth unto himself." And it follows, "As is true of the church and of the individual. Beautiful services and impressive messages from the pulpit fail of the larger result if they do not send congregations out to active service in the world. Nearly all well-to-do congregations now realize something of their responsibility to their less fortunate brothers and sisters, and have established numerous life-saving stations throughout the city." Oops. Oh, I'm sorry. glossed over the text, but here is the Saint Thomas Chapel, which we spoke about last time, was one of those such stations on the east side. It was established by St. Thomas Church on 60th Street between 2nd and 3rd Avenues, now known as All Saints Independent Parish. But it was built in 1872 and rebuilt in 1894 as a mission to the populations on the east side. The poor, and they were somewhat impoverished. While admission to services in parish life in the great church on Fifth Avenue was limited to those who could afford the substantial pew rents, the chapel was free and open to all. It became a center for voluntary efforts by the Fifth Avenue congregation to the service of the industrious poor, located largely on the far Upper East Side. By 1904, the array of initiatives at the chapel was extraordinary. Under the watchful eye of Father Stiers and his predecessor John Wesley Brown, and under the direct supervision of a vicar at the chapel, this included a huge array of activities. There was the Helping Hand Association, the Halsey Day Nursery, the Employment Society, the kindergarten, the church, it's a long list, the mothers' meetings, the sewing school, the Penny Provident Fund to teach immigrants how to save, Girls Friendly Society, the Kitchen Garden, the Diet Kitchen, the Maternity Society, the Visiting Nurse, the cobbling classes, which I found interesting, to help teach people how to repair their shoes. There was a boys' club in the neighborhood for the chapel. There was a special St. Thomas troop of the Knights of Temperance. They said where young men were trained in the habits of soberness, purity, and reverence, with no pledge being required of the members, who are simply given to understand that loyalty to the aims of the society is a matter of individual honor. There was the Employment Association, the Women's Auxiliary, the Missionary Guild, that sent books and other materials to Episcopal missions throughout the world. The Domestic Committee, the Foreign Committee. There was the Church Periodical Club, sending periodicals, hymnals, and congregational material to Mexico, Japan, and China. There was the Indian Committee, fostering scholarships and medical supplies to missions in the Dakotas in Wyoming. There was the Freedmen's Committee, scholarships and boxes, presumably largely for black parishes and institutions in the southern states. There were the diocesan or city missions, supporting 2 chapels in the Bronx, specifically for colored people. There were also the missions to colored people, boxes sent to churches in Kansas, South Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee. Some of these boxes with a value of nearly $400, and this was a time when the average worker made $200 to $400 a year. There was the industrial school, primarily teaching women in the city skills to be self-supporting. So all this was going on out of this church and the mission over on the east side. And the 1904 report of the Vicar of St. Thomas to Dr. Stiers read, while recognizing the grace of human sympathy and the beauty of human helpfulness, we do not forget that the motive for both must be found in something else higher than either. If they are to endure and become permanent factors in molding character, it is difficult to continue long and well-doing unless the inspiration and power are drawn from sources higher than the thing done. So it was a very active commitment to the community and a stunning example of the social gospel movement at the beginning of the century. But in the end, sustaining this kind of commitment was difficult, particularly through the early years of the 20th century. Stiers articulated a simple formula of those who have, helping those in need to the benefit of everyone. But it was always challenging. Locally, it was hard to keep pace with the changing nature of the city, changing neighborhoods, and so forth. But even though one statistic that I found interesting was between the years 1901 and 1906, the chapel, the Saint Thomas Chapel, made 37,000 house visits and 16,000 office calls. So their web was truly staggering, their reach was truly staggering. But there were larger forces integral to the general welfare of the population of the city that complicated Father Steyer's simple and direct message. And I want to briefly note just four: labor unions, the Russian Revolution, the emergence of the social sciences, and the Great Depression of the 1930s. And here I'm not attempting to take on all these broad, enormous historical developments within the broad sweep of history, but rather my purpose here is just to indicate how these larger forces at the start of the 20th century complicated the idea of what is Christian charity in the way that Steyer's articulated it in this extraordinary statement, and within the context of the aims of the social gospel movement. So first, the labor unions. You will recall that on March 25th, 1911, the well-known Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in Greenwich Village took the lives of 145, mostly Italian and Jewish female garment workers. The stunning event ignited progressive forces in the city. There was a push to improve the city's fire department, building codes, and workplace regulations. Reaction to the disaster spurred the growth of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. That union, formed in 1900, was a major player in the growth of the American Federation of Labor. It grew rapidly in its first 2 decades and took credit for abolishing sewing work in the tenements, establishing a 6-day, 54-hour work week, writing union contracts that gave preference to union members when applying for jobs, and setting up arbitration machinery in factories when problems arose. The union movement raised issues of what constitutes a just wage, a protected work environment, and the larger issue of inequalities in the industrial age. In these discussions, the ideas of what constitutes Christian charity at the heart of Steyer's mission were pushed by newer formulations of social justice and control. Where charity was at the direction of the giver, social justice was determined more by the receiver. The idea of Christian charity was then complicated by issues of control, expectations, and limits. The second thing was the Russian Revolution. In 1917, the total nationalization of the economy of Russia and the consequent wiping out of private capital sent shockwaves through the upper echelons of the New York City population, whose fortune rested on the institutions of private enterprise. The fact that Vladimir Lenin's Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party could undermine the Tsarist regime demonstrated in terms all too real that a popular labor-led movement could successfully take over the reins of government. It was a staggering development. The reaction in the United States was swift. There was the so-called Red Scare that began at the end of World War I. The U.S. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer carried out a series what is known as the Palmer Raids against foreign-born individuals who were accused of anarchist, communist, and radical leftist sympathies. The Palmer Raids, which were sometimes brutal and of questionable constitutionality, drew increasing criticism from the public as they failed to produce evidence of a Bolshevik conspiracy here in the United States. Here in New York City, in 1920, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union was torn by battles between its established leadership and communists within the group. Now, as we know, the philosophical and ideological origins of the Bolshevik Revolution drew from the philosophical writings of Karl Marx and other critics of the dislocations brought on by the industrial age. Marx embraced the idea of socialism and would famously argue in 1875, from each according to his abilities and to each according to his needs. It was atheistic. Marx in 1844 famously stated religion is the opium of the masses. And it was militant. At the base of Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto of 1848 was a call for workers of the world to unite. So Steyer's simple message could in many ways be interpreted as a kind of Christian socialism, calling for the redistribution of money from those who have too much to those who have too little. And it's important to, oops, not yet. Press what? Which one? Oh, this one?
Yes.
Oh.
Thank you.
All right. Not over yet. No. Look at this. Okay. There we go. Pause. Steyer's simple message could in many ways be interpreted as a kind of Christian socialism, calling for a redistribution of money for those who have too much, to those who have too little, and it's important to emphasize, where I got caught, it's important to emphasize to the benefit of both groups. But the Russian Revolution brought on fear as to how far this could go and who would control the process. Christian charity at the heart of Steyer's message raised questions of socialism, but socialism was linked to communism, and communism was linked to atheism. So it became more difficult to navigate this message among these forces for change. The third thing is the rise of the social sciences. And the third of these developments is far less appreciated, I think, than the other two. In the late 19th century, the new field of experimental psychology was spreading from the German-speaking world throughout the West. These psychologists were looking at new ways to understand the spiritual nature of the universe. Much of this thinking was fueled by the enormous social transformations brought on by the urban industrial economies. While not a rejection of Christianity outright, this movement challenged the authority of religion on matters of self-identity, community, and the moral order. The root of this new mode of thinking was the observation that instead of thinking of ourselves as a creation of a higher power, they argued that we humans are, in fact, ourselves of our own creation. So essentially, coming to grips with who we are was not a spiritual question, but rather a question of our place in the wider community of humanity. Who we are and what we are then is a matter more complete of self-understanding and also of understanding the environment in which we grow and develop. It's also how we understand ourselves in relationship to others and how others perceive us and interact with us. All relationships are thus important: parent-child, mother-daughter, husband-wife, teacher-child, neighbor-neighbor, worker-supervisor. We as people then are individually and collectively a product of our environment. So this challenge has it was then really twofold. First, the question was how to come to an understanding of how our broader social environment is determinant on who we are and what we have become. Second, if individuals are shaped by these environmental factors, could then they intervene in their own development? Could that process of change be applied to society as a whole, thus reshaping the social nature of man on earth? So from the point of view of what we're talking about today, salvation was not only redemption after death, but more importantly, we could all be changed by understanding and thus reshaping the nature and structure of our social environment now. So this was the thrust of the social sciences that appeared in the most prominent universities in the United States and Europe in the late 19th century. The idea of the research university was, among other things, a place where the constant change of the environmental factors shaping our lives would be studied with the results then applied to a changing world. these studies would be focused more on corrective action rather than spiritual renewal. So we had courses in social psychology, sociology, social work, social behavioralism, and this whole movement was led by, among others, the famous American philosopher John Dewey and William James and George Herbert Mead and others. We also had projects to affect the social environment, to achieve human betterment and social change. Many were positive, like the playground movement, for example. Children need playground. And the St. Thomas's summer home that we talked about last time was part of that idea. Food and drug safety, urban housing and design projects, the idea of special courts for juvenile offenders. And there were less attractive dimensions of this too, like eugenics, involuntary sterilization, which all with the notion of not spiritual salvation, but human betterment and social reform. So where labor unions had pushed Christian charity towards ideas of social justice, and where the events in Russia towards matters of ideology, social science and its emphasis on observation of human action, on research, on environmental change, pushed ideas of charity into the broader research agenda of American universities and toward achieving practical solutions to social problems. And this essentially is pragmatism that we all know have heard about. Where the churches observed the problem and took action, universities studied the problem and looked to the government and other organizations to take action. They influenced local governments on education, social programs, and other matters of social reform. Charity was not only a helping hand, but it was also a matter of studying, identifying, and transforming the roots and effects of poverty and want. So, the fourth thing I want to talk about is the Great Depression. All that I've talked about was enormously complicated by the Great Depression of the 1930s. We all know the great crash of the stock market in 1929, but the Great Depression really marked the years following that. Those years were characterized by the consequent collapse of the economy in general. In New York City, for example, in 1932, half the city's factories were closed. Almost 1/3 of New Yorkers were unemployed. These numbers challenged the traditional role of the churches to reach out and help. The scale of the problem was well beyond the capacity of religious institutions. Governments at the local level, in conjunction with private agencies, including churches, began to raise and allocate funds to provide aid for the unemployed and the poor. 1.6 million New Yorkers were in need in 1932. The city began to look for assistance from the state of New York. And to give some perspective to this, the report of St. Thomas Chapel in 1931 noted that it had given aid to 600 people, 600 families. And that was a huge commitment for the chapel, but a drop in the bucket in the context of the scale of the problem. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, not as president, but as governor of New York, was unique among governors at the time and chose to accept liability for his constituents. He declared, quote, "Upon the state falls the duty of protecting and sustaining those of its citizens who, through no fault of their own, find themselves unable to maintain life." Quote. Essentially, he was saying, not without controversy, that charity is a government responsibility. To make a long story short, Roosevelt became president in 1932 and launched his famous New Deal program of economic assistance and reform. Given the scale of the New Deal and its premise that social welfare was to a great extent the responsibility of government, the idea of Christian charity was absorbed into questions of public policy, political affiliation, and partisan ideology. For purposes of this lecture, and by way of closing, I want to focus not so much on what the New Deal was or what it accomplished, but rather on how Roosevelt chose to explain it to a skeptical public. He did not choose the rhetoric of trade unions or even social justice. He did not set it in the ideological terms of a progressive socialism, nor did he attempt to set it within the prevailing ideas and research results derived from the social sciences. Rather, and I find extremely interesting, he sermonized on the issues. His words, interestingly, echo Steyer's sense of moral imperative 28 years later, 28 years after that 1904 report. In his first inaugural address, he said, "The money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truths. The measure of the restoration lies in the extent to which we apply social value more noble than monetary profit. Happiness," he said, "lies not in the mere possession of money, it lies in the joy of achievement, the thrill of creative effort. The joy and moral stimulation of work no longer must be forgotten in the mad chase of evanescent profits. These dark days will be worth all they cost us, if they teach us that our true destiny is not to be ministered unto, but to minister to ourselves and to our fellow men." And then in his second inaugural address, he famously said, "I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, and ill-nourished. It's not in despair that I paint you that picture. I paint it for you in hope, because the nation, seeing and understanding the injustice in it, proposes to paint it out. We are determined to make every American citizen the subject of his country's interest and concern, and we will never regard any faithful law-abiding group within our borders as superfluous. The test of our progress is not whether we add more abundance," and here he's almost quoting Steyer's verbatim, "the test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much, it's whether we provide for those who have too little." So to conclude, Steyer's words were part of a movement at his time to achieve a vision of Christian charity in a just world. And I have no knowledge, and you may know, whether Steyer's ever met Franklin Roosevelt or whether their paths crossed. But I cannot say that, so I can't say that Roosevelt was quoting Steyer. But I think he chose this line of argument as a good politician because this way of thinking was in the air. People, for the most part, would recognize the points he was raising and understand the context. And I thought it really speaks to the role of the pulpit at that time in getting this message out, and as it should be in our lives today. But in the end, we are still faced with the challenges Father Steyer so eloquently addressed in the 1904 yearbook. How do we find the right balance between what to give and what to keep? Today it seems even more complicated, raising the question of the very nature of charity itself. Is it a matter of politics, a matter of government policy, a matter of political ideology, a matter of social understanding and research, a matter of tax deductibility? But lost in the debates today, I think, are two essential points about charity that were emphasized by Father Steyer more than a century ago in this church. First, it's a matter of faith, and second, it's a matter of spiritual fulfillment, both to the person who receives and to the person who gives. Thank you.
Thank you.